In a world that is more populated and crowded than ever before, it seems that more and more people are experiencing isolation and loneliness. Joining me now via Skype from Hamilton, Ontario is Ray Pennings, the Executive VP of the Christian think tank Cardis. Ray, welcome back to BCN.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Ray, Cardis conducted a survey in partnership with the Angus Reid Institute, and it discovered that 23% of Canadians suffer from extreme social isolation and loneliness. Now, that's close to 1 out of every 4 people. Did those numbers kind of surprise you?
Not really. The trend has been studied for a few years. The problem in Great Britain is such that they actually created a cabinet position, a minister for loneliness. And certainly within Canada, there have been various aspects of loneliness, particularly among seniors in various groups that have been studied. So our motive in commissioning this survey was very much trying to get a more comprehensive look at the extent of the problem. And certainly we found it's very real and serious here in Canada as well.
Ray, let's get a little more specific about the survey itself. Individuals were put into 5 different categories. Tell me more about that.
So essentially we measured 2 things. We measured loneliness and we measured isolation. So isolation is a measurement of how many people you interact with. So outside of the people you live with in your household, how often do you talk to your neighbor? How often do you go to the theater? How often do you go to the library? Loneliness is your emotional feelings regarding a desiring to talk to others. So, for example, if you had a financial need, do you have someone that you'd be able to turn to lend you a small amount of money? Ironically, 1 in 3 Canadians don't. If you were to receive an emotional news, a call from the doctor regarding a diagnosis, do you know who you would call to talk to? 1 in 5 Canadians don't. And then what we did is we put together those who were both isolated and lonely on the one extreme, and those who were neither on the other, and then all of the different permutations with the average, of course, in the middle. And you get roughly 5 categories of Canadians. And then we started to look at the different characteristics of each of those groups.
Now, can you define what is meant by extreme isolation and loneliness?
So extreme isolation and loneliness are those people who are in both categories. They are both lonely and they are isolated. So these are the people who generally, what's interesting is there is no single characteristic which puts you into the group. You can be earning $100,000 and be in any of these 5 groups. You can be poor and be earning in any of these 5 groups. That said, those who were most likely to be on the negative side of the spectrum were younger Canadians. So there is a sense. Now they tend to skew towards the feelings of loneliness. They have more contacts. They're a little less isolated, but they are feeling lonely. Whereas on the other side of it, older Canadians have less contacts, those 55 plus, but are more likely to be content and not having the cravings for the sort of contacts that they wish. But those who are on the extreme side have both and are in the most trouble.
So when it comes to maybe, let's say, millennials, is part of what's causing the isolation tied in with social media? People are spending a lot of time on Twitter, Instagram, as opposed to personal one-on-one interactions?
Our poll doesn't get far enough in terms of making the diagnosis. We can look at correlations. So, we highlighted on the negative side. What's interesting is on the positive side. Sometimes you can learn in terms of those who don't have it, what's unique about them. And there were 2 things that stood out: family and faith. They were hugely overrepresented in terms of being married with kids, and they were hugely overrepresented in terms of participating and regularly attending a community of worship. So on the positive side, those things are much less, to make you much less likely to be socially isolated.
And the negative side, maybe it is some of that social media as opposed to one-on-one interaction. Now, is it one particular age group, as I mentioned, the millennials, or is it widespread? Maybe seniors as well are feeling a lot of loneliness.
It is, every group is in every category. So, while there are more of one than the other, there are no single factors that are identified as here is the, whether social media, as you mentioned, poverty, education. You can make distinctions and to say the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be here or there. But there are people with PhDs on the negative side of the spectrum as well.
Now, when someone suffers from loneliness, how does that really impact their lives? Do we see a lot more cases of depression, anxiety?
So obviously there are the mental health aspects of this, but there are very practical things. For example, I mentioned the fact of if you came into a financial crisis, do you know somebody who could loan you some money? One out of three don't. Well, maybe payday loans, that whole industry and some of the negative sides of that. Maybe that this has something to do with loneliness as well. So there are a host of social impacts. Certainly, there's significant impacts on the health system as well. Significant mental health costs associated with this.
It's interesting how you made mention earlier that some Canadians don't even know their neighbors. I just bought a house recently here in Lethbridge, and the first thing I did the first couple of days, I went in, I was chatting with my neighbors, shaking their hands, and they said, you know what? The other neighbor that lived there for so many years, we didn't even get to know them. We didn't know their name. We didn't know anything about them. So what's stopping us from reaching out and getting to know our neighbors? Is it fear? Are we too busy?
It's interesting. 45% of Canadians have not spoken to their neighbor in the last month. So
Not even to borrow a lawnmower?
I have no idea. There was no need for them apparently to talk to their neighbors, and yet we are having these widespread issues of loneliness. So it is interesting. You're in Lethbridge, a community that's surrounded by a more rural network, and there is some difference between rural and urban on this. I think some of the geography in terms of a lot of our suburbs where we have our garage doors, we drive inside with our door opener, you perhaps wave, but you don't talk to your neighbor. You don't have porches that are big enough to sit on. So we live isolated lives in which we all exist with our own families, and a lot of the interaction that we need to really be human is missing from our lives.
So let's talk more about those social institutions which really help protect against isolation and loneliness. Like you mentioned earlier, family and faith. How important are they?
Well, they're very important. It's interesting when we ask the people who are lonely and what is it that you crave. The numbers were off the charts. In the 90% where I wish I had more time with family. That was overwhelming, the result. And we can take a look at the history of the family unit, divorce, family breakdown, all of these factors. That really, we're a generation in now of a lot of these social experiments. We have not had a complete life cycle yet of every generation having gone through where divorce is mainstream and common, and marriages break up with the frequency that they do in modern society. And I think we're now seeing that this isn't just a result of individual choice. It has consequences. It's interesting when you think of, the promise of individualism is that you can be whoever you want. But for me to be who I want, I need people around me. I want a we life. I want a life with others, which means that I can't just think in terms of I. I need to think in terms of we. And yet we have been keep preaching that life is all about having what you want as an individual. And I think we've missed out on emphasizing the importance of the institutions to which we belong.
I understand that the frequency of prayer also plays a vital role. Tell me more about that.
Well, prayer is it's interesting in the sense of prayer, and I can get theological and all the rest on that, but there is a sense in which when you are praying, you are making your needs known to God, but you're also hearing them yourself, even as you do that. And so there is something about that. I think that process. I also think that the very act of prayer is an act of recognizing another, a transcendent, that I am not myself, but I live in relationship to others. If I see myself living in relationship to God, I'm also more likely to see myself relationship to of God's image bearers around whom I live.
Let's really dissect a person's education and their financial position and how it really impacts their loneliness, right?
Well, so older. Obviously, on the negative end, poverty does increase your likelihood to be on the negative side. Although there are lots of people who are in the lowest social economic bracket who are in the most positive side. So no, by no means is there a direct correlation. But obviously, financial need does, create anxieties, creates fear in terms of talking to others, creates reluctance in terms of going out. Sometimes being with other people costs. So there's a whole host of things that just very practically carry forward in terms of economics. But the irony is neither education or economics were anywhere near the same as family and faith in terms of the strength of the correlation between the two.
You know, you live in Hamilton. I lived in Hamilton as well for many years. It has a very strong Portuguese and Italian community. And I know a lot of people in those communities. They're very interactive. They're always bringing family over, always chatting. I don't see a lot of loneliness. So do you think it's also tied in with culture, depending upon the culture we were raised in?
Absolutely. I think there is a sense in which, among immigrants, there is a sense among first generation immigrants, they need each other. They need each other to help. A poll we did with Angus Reid Institute last year looking at immigration, found that 50% of the immigrants in Canada had received material help from a faith community. Um, we take a look at, we brought in all these Syrian refugees last year. You take a look at the difference a year later between those who were sponsored by faith communities versus those who were government sponsored. I don't have the number at my fingertips, but I saw something the other day, and I think it was you were 5 times more likely to be employed if you were brought in by a faith community than if you were supported by the government 1 year later.
How about other minority groups? Let's talk a bit about Blacks, Asian people. Did they feel more or less isolated?
The marginalized groups, physically handicapped, LGBT, some of those groups were among those. So the groups you would, Indigenous, those whom, if I said marginalized groups in Canada and you create the list, most of them found themselves on the more isolated side of the equation. There was a disproportionate connection there. Again, the survey did not go as far, we with the survey, we're able to describe, we're not able to make correlations or say this is because of that. We simply, given the tool, we're able to make some of these linkages to say they are certainly more likely to be in those groups.
Now, the survey revealed that 62% of Canadians wish family and friends would spend much more time with them. Do you have any suggestions as how we can change our culture to facilitate spending more time together?
Well, I think there is a sense of just plan the family reunions, the birthday parties, a lot of those things that used to be part of everyday family life that brought families together on a regular basis. Part of it is, even size of families make a difference today. I grew up in a family with 3 siblings. There were 4 of us. Today, the average is much smaller than that. So there are many less opportunities if you only have birthdays and that. So, you know, do things together. It's good for family, but it's also good for you.
So, what advice would you give to parents who are raising their children to become a little more interactive in society so they're
Well,
not
I
so
think
socially awkward, perhaps, as they get older?
participate in the community, get involved in your local Rotary Club, your local ball team, go to the library,
Your church, right?
your church, volunteer. Um, there are lots of opportunities. There are lots of needs in the world, and think about how you can help others. And when you think about how you can help others, you'll end up overcoming a lot of the challenges that you're facing yourself as well.
Maybe helping out seniors as well, volunteering at some seniors' homes.
Absolutely. Certainly, one of the big issues that the poll identified again in a descriptive way is the fact that a lot of seniors are living alone. And certainly, I think we both realize the fact from just our own knowledge of seniors networks, sometimes shoveling their walks or getting their groceries or taking them to a doctor becomes an increasing challenge, especially when one spouse is gone and they're living alone. So adopt the senior on your street. Help them out. And it's amazing, I think, how much those sorts of activities can make a difference.
And think of all of the wonderful stories that seniors can share with us and the wisdom that they can impart on us as well, right?
Absolutely. No generation is isolated or has a monopoly on wisdom and insight. And in our age, when we're busy apologizing for everything previous generations did, it seems some days, I wonder whether or not we might not be wizened by listening to some of the stories. And perhaps there was a little more wisdom and context for some of the decisions than we give credit for.
Ray Pennings, the Executive Vice President of the Christian think tank Cardis, thanks a lot for joining me today from Hamilton, Ontario.
Thank you so much for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless. Have a great night.